Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to Speech in the Silence, the podcast that is all Thelema all the time. Visit us and listen to our complete archive of programming at speechinthesilence.com or contact us at thelemapodcast@gmail.com.
Well, thank you all so much for coming out early on a Sunday morning. I know it was a big night yesterday for all of us. My throat is like so ragged just from like talking to people in noisy rooms. I hope it holds out for the rest of this day's talks. But welcome to a discussion on Aleister Crowley on death, philosophical, technical, and practical aspects. I did want to mention that there is a recording device down here. We're capturing this talk for possible podcast, provided I don't blow this whole thing. So just wanted to let you know about that. No one's faces is being captured, however. So this talk is a version of something that I gave at Tahuti Lodge as part of a bereavement seminar that they put on in the summer of 2008 after they lost two of their key members, our key members. And it was a real difficult blow to the community, and this is something that was put together by the local EGC to help people come to terms with this devastating pair of losses. And not too long after that, I actually had the opportunity to chat with Sister Margot Adler. You may or may not know that she was one of our sisters, but she was. And we had met at a pagan conference in Connecticut, and she was observing that since she wrote Drawing Down the Moon in the 70s, she had seen how the pagan movement had been aging. You know, it had been around now for 30 years, and the really dedicated core people who got this movement started were now older, and they were experiencing mobility issues and health issues, and she was really concerned about how that community was going to deal with the advancing age of its senior members, and that's something that certainly seems to be the case with us in OTO too. We're roughly of a similar age from OTO's reorganization in the late 60s, early 70s. And in fact, since I've given this talk, OTO bodies around the country have in fact experienced significant losses of its members, some far too soon. And that makes this, in my mind, I guess as good a time as any to talk about this, particularly since it was part of the suggestions of themes that would be appropriate for this year's Noticon. Even though we do have a slideshow here, the slideshow really isn't kind of integral to what I'm going to talk about. You can just close your eyes and listen to me, or fall asleep if you like. The slideshow is basically if you want to follow along with something I'm reading. Some people find that more distracting, so again, the slideshow is just there if you missed something I said and you want to catch back up to it. The way this is set up, we're going to talk about philosophical views of death in Thelema, and that's going to be basically appealing to the holy books and Crowley's commentaries on them. I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical aspects. In other words, like what happens or how does this stuff work according to Crowley? And then finally, we're going to touch on some practical aspects. What are some actual magical techniques that are available to us to use, to prepare, to cope with, and to better understand death? So, beginning with the philosophical overview, one of the key things that we get out of Thelema is this idea of the sanctity of life. For instance, in Liber 101, we read that children, mothers, and pregnant women are especially sacred. And so, therefore, it follows that life is especially sacred. And the only sin is restriction, per Liber Al. And therefore, it is anathema to us to restrict the free will of another living being. And following on this, then, is the concept that death should only come to a person who has exhausted the full potential of their life. So, I guess another way of saying that is that death is actually the completion of one's life or the fulfillment of one's will. So, turning to Liber L. we read, chapter 2, death, thou shalt long for death. Death is forbidden, O man, unto thee. The length of thy longing shall be the strength of its glory. He that lives long and desires death much is ever the king among kings. Now, far be it from me to tell you what this means, so I'll let Crowley do that. Looking at the commentaries on this verse, we see that he writes, to long for death is to aspire to the complete fulfillment of all one's potentialities, and would evidently be an error to insist upon passing on to one's next life while there were hawsers unhitched from this one. Which is, I think, a very interesting comment, because the implication there is suicide, kind of ending your path here before you've completed your will, is not necessarily a good idea. Which raises the question of, well, how does that tie in with Liber Oz? Because it's in Liber Oz where we have the rights of man stated, which includes the idea that man has the right to die when and how he will. Now, these are not necessarily contradictory ideas. I mean, these are still rights in my mind that one would retain, but as we see this passage from Crowley, I mean, his view, nevertheless, is that one that, it's a bad idea to not finish your will in this incarnation. Moving on from there, another idea that we find in our texts is that death is the flip side of love. It's kind of like two sides of the same coin. And in our language, we represent this by the union or the dissolution of the ego into the body of Nuit, or dissolution into its true self. So for some examples of this, we can look at this passage from the Confessions, for instance, where Crowley writes that as soon as we learn that everything is only half, that it implies its opposite, we can let ourselves go with a light heart, finding just as much fun in the red leaves of autumn as in the green leaves of spring, and so on. Additionally, in the Law of Liberty, Crowley writes, it is shown later in our initiation rituals how this can be, how death itself is an ecstasy like love, but more intense, the reunion of the soul with itself. Returning to Liber L, we find some passages that tie into this idea as well. So, for instance, in chapter 2, verse 6, we all know this one from the Mass, I am the flame that burns in every heart of man, in the core of every star, I am life and the giver of life. Yet therefore is the knowledge of me, the knowledge of death. Moving on in that same chapter, we have, I, feast, rejoice, there is no dread hereafter. There is the disillusion and the eternal ecstasy in the kisses of new. And even later in that chapter, we get the passage of, thrill with the joy of life and death. Thy death shall be lovely. Whoso seeth shall be glad. Thy death shall be the seal of the promise of our age-long love. Come, lift up thine heart and rejoice. We are one, we are good. And finally, at the end of this passage, we get death is the crown of all. So, death is the flip side of love. Another idea that comes out here is that there is actually no such thing as death. It is actually an illusion of our perception, of our frame of reference. Death is simply the soul graduating or advancing to another level of its existence. And so in Liber Aleph, for instance, we read, for men thought that the sun died and was reborn alike in the day and in the year, and so also was the mystery of man. Now already are we well assured by science how the death of the sun is in truth but the shifting of a shadow. And in this eon, O my son, I lift my voice and make a prophecy, so shall it be proven as to death. And in the commentaries, Crowley writes, for a life which has fulfilled all its possibilities ceases to have a purpose, Death is its diploma, so to speak. It is ready to apply itself to the new conditions of a larger life. Just so a schoolboy who has mastered his work dies to school, reincarnates in cap and gown, triumphs in the trips, dies in the cloisters, and is reborn to the world. Death is, to the initiate, an inn by the wayside. It marks a stage accomplished. It offers refreshment, repose, and advice as to the plans for the morrow. So, kind of summarizing, so life is sacred. Death is kind of the fulfillment of that life and of the will. And that we look at death in the holy books, or it's expressed in the holy books, as two sides of the same coin, of which love is one side and death is the other, and that the whole experience is essentially that dissolving into the ecstasy of nuit, and that the perception or experience of death is an illusion from our perspective here on the material plane. And so that brings to our conclusion kind of some of the reflection I wanted to share with you on the textual discussion about death and Philemon. Here we have a picture of Gnostic Mass from the Agape Lodge days, which are appropriate for our next section, where we ask, so what actually happens to us when we die? Well, looking at the end collect in the Mass, I guess before we get into that, I would say that Crowley pretty much says we don't know. He acknowledges that we don't know. And when we look at the end collect in the Gnostic Mass, there are two, I think, significant things about this. So one reflects Philemon's attitude toward death, is the idea that everyone stands up, head erect, eyes open. We're not hiding ourselves, bowing our heads. We're kind of looking at death, head on. But then we get this idea, unto them from whose eyes the veil of life hath fallen, may there be granted the accomplishment of their true wills, whether they will absorption in the infinite, or to be united with their chosen and preferred, or to be in contemplation, or to be at peace, or to achieve the labor and heroism of incarnation on this planet or another, or any star or aught else. May there be granted the accomplishment of their wills. And you can kind of look at this a couple ways. One is this saying that, well, we don't really know what's going to happen, but we hope you get what you're expecting. Another way of looking at this, though, is that the afterlife is actually something that's much more malleable and plastic than, and not this one-dimensional thing that you might be inclined to think. There may not be a one-size-fits-all answer. And this may just be saying, hey, whichever of these options on this, Chinese restaurant menu of afterlives are there, maybe you get the one that's, that is in line with your true will. Another one of these nuts and bolts aspects I'd like to talk about would be the Kabbalistic view of the psyche or the soul. And from this, Crowley kind of introduces this kind of timeline of when the soul actually inhabits the about-to-be-born child. But basically, there's a few ways you can graph the tree of life and the worlds of creation and the parts of the soul. And this is just one way I'm going to present here, but but it kind of ties into the way Crowley talks about it in a passage I'll read to you in a moment. But the idea here is that the soul or the spirit expresses itself through different modalities, which have names in the Kabbalah. So the one aspect is the nephesh, which can be translated as the life, the self, the person, emotions, or passion, and they correspond to the world of Asiya, the most physical of the four worlds of creation. So Crowley would look at this as the way that the spirit expresses itself through the physical vehicle, the body. Next, you have the ruach, the breath, the wind, the spirits, or the intellect, and this would occupy the world of Yetzirah, and it's this middle cluster of Sephirot on the tree of life. kind of like the whole Adam-Kadmon kind of complex there. And then beyond that, there's this third level, and there's actually sub-levels to it, but the supernal triad on the tree of life inhabits the pieces of the soul called the neshama, the breath, the spirit, the haya, which is the root of the toast, l'chaim, to life, the vital energy. And finally, you also have the akida, the singular, the highest part of the soul. But again, from a practical standpoint, we can look at this as being those three modes of expression of the spirit, the way it expresses itself through the physical body, through the intellect, and then through this highest part of the spirit. So when we turn to Magic Without Tears, Crowley writes that the supernal triad constitutes the eternal essence of man. That is the positive expression of an ultimate point of view. Death merely means the dropping off of the nefesh, the malkuth, so that the man takes over his instrument of mind, the ruach, with him to his next suitably chosen vehicle. And in fact, in that previous sentence, Crowley writes, now when a man spends his life building up and developing the six sephiroth of the ruach so that they cohere closely in proper balance and relation, in the forging and developing and maintaining the link of steel between this ruach and the triad, this is what happens when you die. The death means just the body falls off, but that stuff you've worked at, building together and cohering the intellect, can kind of transfer over into the next chosen vehicle. So then we have a man not only very well prepared through these exercises to reincarnate at once. This means about 6 months after his death. For his vehicle will be a fetus about 3 months old. So that's kind of Crowley's timeline of when this kind of happens. And as an example, Crowley believed himself to be the reincarnation of Eliphas Levi. There we go. And if you look at these dates, Eliphas Levi died on May 31st, 1875. Crowley was born October 12th, 1875. Now, if you do the math, that's not 3 months. That's actually, between those two dates is 4 months, 13 days. So if Crowley was in fact Eliphas Levi, then young fetus Crowley didn't have Levi living in his body until about the 5th month of Emily Bishop Crowley's pregnancy. So 3 months, more give or take 2 months. Okay. So this tells us how it works, or at least according to this Kabbalistic model. But what actually happens when you die? Well, let's look at some of those possibilities. Typically, it's going to be one of two things. There's either samadhi or disillusion, the state that in Hinduism and Buddhism is called moksha, release from the wheel of karma. You no longer reincarnate. You're absorbed back into the infinite. The flip side of that is if you're not free of the wheel of karma, then you're still there and you're going to reincarnate. So, as Crowley writes in the commentaries, the body itself, the body is itself a restriction as well as an instrument. When death is as complete as it should be, the individual expands and fulfills himself in all directions. It is an omniform samadhi. This is, of course, eternal ecstasy in the sense already explained. But in the time world, karma reconcentrates the elements and a new incarnation occurs. But these are not the only two options. It's not just disillusion or reincarnation. Crowley does allow for the idea of hauntings. And these are a result of the mind holding on to the ego and just not letting go after death. Although he acknowledges that these things tend to break down over time. And Crowley's, we don't dwell a lot about this, but Crowley does address it. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun to bring it up. So in Liber Aleph, writing on death, Crowley writes, if the mind be attached constantly to the body, death hath no power to decompose it wholly, but a decaying shell of the dead man, his mind holding together for a little his body of light, haunteth the earth. These shells are broken away utterly from the star that did enlighten them, and they are vampires, obsessing them that adventure themselves into the astral world without magical preparation, or invoke them, as do the spiritists. Crowley further comments on these spiritists that the medium gets into communication with the shells of the dead, the clip-off, the Kabbalah calls them. A month or so, perhaps a year or so, in the case of minds very solidly constructed or very passionately attached, and the shell's messages begin to be less and less coherent, more and more fragmentary. So the idea is that they use this ruach stuff rather than passing it on, kind of hangs on and can leave these impressions, but it's not stable and eventually disintegrates. So to summarize, we've got these three options, the more common of which are the first two, and reincarnation, of course, being the most common. So how can we avoid one of these less desirable outcomes? I'm going to be talking like theoretically here, or practical stuff is still going to be a little bit later in the talk. But Crowley in his writings does talk about the importance of mystical exercises to die properly. And in that previous passage I read, where he talks about how proper training of the mind allows the intellect to kind of carry over into the next incarnation. That's one illustration of that point. As another example, again coming to us from Liber Aleph, Crowley writes that death is a disillusion in the kiss of Our Lady Nuit. It is the summit of our holy art to present the whole being of our star to Our Lady in the nuptial of our bodily death. We are then to make our whole engine the true and real appurtenance of our force, without leak or friction any other waste or hindrance to its action. Also thou oughtest to increase thy vehicle in mass by true growth and balance, that thou be a bridegroom comely and well favored, a man of might, and a warrior worthy of the bed of so divine a disillusion. So then all it is, make sure you prepare yourself for this thing. You know it's going to come sooner or later. Avoid the rush. As far as the journey, what actually happens after death, Crowley offers a few ideas here. As he says, it is therefore of the very first importance to train the mind in every possible way and to bind it to the higher principles by steady, by constant, by flaming aspiration, fortified by the sternest discipline and by continuously reformulated oaths. Such a man will be fully occupied after his death with the unremitting search for his new instrument. He will brush aside, as he has made a habit of doing during his life, the innumerable lures of reward and the like. Then he kind of goes on to say, the plain fact is that I remember nothing at all of any of my post-mortem experiences, and I have never known anyone else who does. So if we kind of think about that from a kind of a standpoint of this Kabbalistic model, and you can kind of think about it as we are living in, asiya, we're living in this physical world, when the experiences that we have when we die are happening at another level of existence. And while that ruach may carry over, those experiences are actually happening on a level of existence that we don't necessarily have access to back here in the physical world. So we might remember the memories of a previous existence, but then that little blip carrying over, as Crowley says, nobody remembers. So there is a journey, but we're just not sure what it is. Another interesting thing is this idea of bundles of Sankara. So let me find where I am here. So the idea that the soul stuff that we're made of doesn't necessarily carry over as a discrete package. It's not a quantum, but it's separate particles, and they don't necessarily all come back all together, one vessel. So Crowley talks about this a bit in Magic Without Tears, and I'm sure it's something we can all relate to with people in their past life memories, whether it's our own or those of other who purport to recall their past lives. Suppose 2 or more people claim simultaneously to have been Crowley, Julius Caesar, or Shakespeare, or, always one very great young. Well, 50 or 60 years, let's see, he talks about it was usually Cleopatra or Mary Queen of Scots or Marie Antoinette, something regal and tragic. But he kind of goes on to so, that was a big laugh, of course. It tended to discredit the whole theory of reincarnation, quite unnecessarily if one looks a little deeper. What do I mean when I say that I think I was Eliphas Levi? No more than that I possess some of his most essential characteristics, and that some of the incidents in his life are remembered by me as my own. These don't seem any, there doesn't seem to be any impossibility about these bundles of Sankara being shared by 2 or more persons. We certainly do not know enough of what actually takes place to speak positively on any such point. So, again, when you get those letters saying I am the reincarnation of Crowley, they may be right, in which case you would be perfectly within your rights to send them a bill for amounts owed. So, then this issue of bundles of Sankara, that's kind of an interesting kind of idea, though, and it's one that Crowley and even Gerald York has talked about. And there's a real interesting letter between Gerald York and Kenneth Grant I wanted to quote for you, where York writes, "Now, if Crowley was an ipsissimus, as he claimed in his diaries, he would not survive after death as a separate individual personality. It is so with all the Jivan Muktis. Jivan Mukti is a Sanskrit term that means self-actualized or self-aware. It's the person who has achieved moksha or is free of the wheel of karma. So it is so with all the Jivan Muktis, who are the oriental level to ipsissimus. As an ipsissimus, Crowley would be above the Mahatma level. Now read his remarks on Mahatmas in the letter about page 100 in my typescript. This letter is in particular key to this idea, but I'm going to quote it to you anyway, just because it's always fun to read Crowley letters. So Crowley writes, "Do you think that Mahatma was going to ask H.P. Blavatsky's opinions or to monkey with their messages? Surely the whole theory is that Mahatma is completely above all ordinary human considerations. You seem to expect them to be images of yourself in rose-colored glasses. Such a Mahatma is in the nature of a wish phantasm, and the proof that he is a Mahatma at all is just exactly this, that he outrages your deepest convictions in every single way. For otherwise, what is the good of his being a Mahatma?" But that kind of, the key idea, though, I wanted to get across here, that quote notwithstanding, is that there is this idea that these bundles of Sankara or soul stuff don't necessarily all carry over in a discrete package. That Crowley admits that it could break up, and parts of it can, turn up in other people. And in some ways, that kind of lends some light to this whole idea of the Bodhisattva, the person who has, escaped the wheel of karma, but elects to come back. And if the Jivan Mukti, the person, doesn't come back as a single soul, then that enlightened part is kind of like a seed that then can spread through the pool of souls, and then they have that potential to likewise escape the wheel of karma and so on, and thereby liberate, all of humanity over the course of time. But we'll come back to that. And there's also an essay by Gerald York on this whole idea of the Jivan Mukti and the bundles of Sankara. Unfortunately, this has all been published in that wonderful collection of Gerald York's essays put out by Titan Press a couple years ago. So, enough of that already. Now we got the nuts and bolts, got the philosophy. What can I do? Well, first and foremost, the obvious one is do your will. That's the key to it all. As we said, death is kind of the conclusion. It's you fulfill your will, your purpose, and then that's what comes next. In the commentaries, Crowley writes, it is all important to ascertain one's true will and to work out every detail of the work of doing it as early in life as one can. It is thus policy for an aspirant to initiation to analyze himself with indefatigable energy, shrewd skill, and accurate subtlety, but then to content himself with observing the interplay of his instincts instead of guiding them. Not until he is familiar with them all should he perform the practices which enable him to read the word of his will. So that's like the first condition. Figure that out so you can do it. Second, good news, you're in the right place. Crowley says, OTO initiations are a great way to gain that training, and not only in how to live, but in how to die. And as he writes in the Confessions, and this is this famous passage where he talks about the OTO system and what the initiations do. I explain the significance of birth and the conditions established by the process, and then show how best to carry on the object in the Eucharist of life. But then we get to, I then proceed to the climax of its career in death, and show how this sacrament both consecrates, or rather sets its seal upon, the previous procedure and gives meaning thereto. In the next ceremony, so this, what I just read, was referring to the third degree, and in the next ceremony, fourth degree, and so on, concluding the Man of Earth, I show how the individual, released by death from the obsession of personality, resumes relations with the truth of the universe. Reality bursts upon him in a blaze of adorable light. He is able to appreciate its splendor as he could not previously do. So our initiations guide us in that. There's a lot of interesting material about death in Liber 101, the open letter to those who may wish to join the order. As with a lot of these foundational documents, there's a lot of interesting concepts in here which sound nice on paper, but in practice are really not feasible. And this first example is one of those. The dying are entitled to return of all their dues. Sorry, we would have spent that long ago. It'd be one thing if we had millions of members like the Masons do, and in fact, at the time that Crowley wrote this, a lot of the Masonic groups also operated, life insurance companies that were part of the Masonic orders, and that's, again, certainly not the way the OTO is set up today. So while Crowley may have been thinking about the way it was done in his lifetime, that's not how we're set up. But it's an interesting concept, or the idea of how OTO relates to members in death. But I think with this next passage, every brother expected to bear witness in his last will and testament to the great benefit that he hath received from the order by bestowing upon it part or the whole of his goods as he may deem fit. And of course we all have families, children, and so on to provide for, but I think one thing this kind of relates to is the idea of the importance of estate planning. You're never too old to do that, and to consider, if you've got a life insurance policy or a will, you can designate a percentage. If you can say, I want 5% to go to OTO, 10%, whatever that percentage is, all of it to go to my spouse, but if he or she predeceases me, then OTO gets it. And again, the idea is, in response to the value you feel you receive out of your experiences and spiritual growth as part of the order. Another idea here is that a banquet ought to be held in honor of the deceased, with dancing, never in merriment, to combat the old eon sorrow surrounding this event. It should be added that when people close to Crowley died, he was very, very sad about it. So this isn't to say that you shouldn't be sad and you shouldn't have those feelings, or that you're bad if you do, but Crowley acknowledged that that's kind of a very deeply ingrained training, in that when Thelema were trying to see past that. I mean, yes, we are sad for ourselves, but we have to recognize that our brother or sister has moved on to the next step of a great adventure, and that's a good thing, and we should celebrate it. So the death of a brother is not to be the occasion of melancholy, but of rejoicing. The brethren of his lodge shall gather together and make a banquet with music and dancing and all manner of gladness. And again, it is of the greatest importance that this shall be done, for thereby the inherited fear of death, which is deep-seated as instinct in us, will gradually be rooted out. It is a legacy from the dead eon of Osiris. And it is our duty to kill it in ourselves, that our children and our children's children may be born free from the curse. And then finally, the eighth house of another section of the eighth house in Liber 101, we read that all brethren are entitled after death to the proper disposal of their remains according to the rights of their order and their grade in it. And in fact, we recently saw a GoFundMe on behalf of one of our recently departed brothers to, in fact, take care of the proper disposal of his remains. And our Geo brethren, certainly stepped up to the plate to help make that happen. Moving on in the commentaries, you get the feast for life is at birth, and the feast for death is at death, at a death. It is of the utmost importance to make funerals merry, so as to train people to take the proper view of death. The fear of death is one of the great weapons of tyrants, as well as their scourge, and it distorts our whole outlook upon the universe. And I just had to include the picture of the New Orleans jazz wedding, because that would be our wedding, the flip side of death, the New Orleans jazz funeral, because that's like, to me, that just totally incorporates this whole outlook, it's of celebrating death. Okay, so now at this point you may be saying, yeah, do your will, take your OTO initiations. The fact that you're all here suggests that you are all doing this or trying to do this. So what else have you got for me? Well, one thing you can do is just jump in with both feet. Contemplate the Bodhisattva oath, which I talked about earlier. Not necessarily saying you should take it, but think about this. And in my opinion, that's especially appropriate for people who are at the third or fourth degree level. And again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, the idea of the Bodhisattva oath is that even though we in our work of developing ourselves spiritually are trying to, again, eliminate karma and achieve that state of moksha, of not reincarnating, the Bodhisattva renounces that privilege and keeps coming back. And essentially is the last person off the wheel after making sure everyone else has gotten off the ride. And here's kind of what Crowley has to say about this. In Magic Without Tears, there is one oath more important than all the rest put together from the point of view of the AA. You swear to refuse all the rewards to acquire your new vehicle without a moment's delay, so that you may carry on your work of helping mankind with the minimum of interruption. Like all true magical oaths, it is certain of success. I can't help but think about the idea of the Bodhisattva oath without thinking of the death character from the Sandman comic books, who once described herself as the one who, at the end of the universe, is the one who puts the chairs on the table, shuts off the lights, and locks the door. And oftentimes when we're leaving the lodge, we're on the 5th floor, like an old warehouse space. And I'll play the Bodhisattva game. And I don't know if anyone even knows what I'm talking about, but we'll leave the lodge, we'll go down the stairs, and if we get down to the first flight of stairs, there's a fire door. So someone opens the fire door, and everyone else passes through. Then we go down the next flight of stairs, and then the person who's at the head of that line holds the door, and then everyone else falls through, and they're now at the back of the line. So it's like, ooh, who's going to be the Bodhisattva? Who's the one that holds the door on the first floor? So you can even have a little bit of fun with that. You can also take things a little bit slower. You're not jump right into the Bodhisattva oath, but you can contemplate this idea of the identity of love and death. So in the Legge Libellum, for example, we read And this is, again, an idea that we've presented already, the idea that love and death are kind of flip sides of the same coin, but not just saying, okay, that's something we read in holy books, but to actually contemplate and meditate on it. So there may be many other modes of attaining the apprehension of true life, and these two following are of much value in breaking the ice of your mortal error and the vision of your being. And of these, the first is the constant contemplation of the identity of love and death, and the understanding of the dissolution of the body as an act of love done upon the body of the universe. As also it is written at length in our holy books, and with this goeth, as it were, sister with twin brother, the practice of mortal love as a sacrament symbolical of the great death. As it is written, kill thyself, and again, die daily. Next are free exercises that Crowley specifically talks about as being very good magical practical exercises, and they may be ones that you're already doing, but I'm hoping that I can kind of present this in a way that you can also look at it in a slightly different context than you might be used to. And these three are Liber Fischarb, the exercises in magical memory, the idea of a magical record, and also of performing Resh. And Fischarb, if you don't recall that one, that's probably the more obscure of these three. The word Fischarb is actually Bereshit, the first word of Genesis written backwards. And so it's this whole idea that you're performing an exercise in thinking in reverse. The idea that you think, if you get practice in this, in reading in reverse, and writing in reverse, thinking and remembering in reverse, you can remember back over the course of your own lifetime, and then thereby kind of make that leap and continue remembering back before that. And the thing about this is if you're doing this in a linear fashion, the next thing you're going to remember is when you die, or when you died before, and that can be a very startling kind of thing. But Crowley talks about how when you encounter this, going through down the line enough times, you kind of get to see the whole continuity of what's happening here. So, let me put this in Crowley's words rather than mine. For how else could one have reasonable certainty, as contrary with faith or interior conviction, otherwise than by the acquisition of the magical memory, the memory of former lives? And this must evidently include that of former deaths. Indeed, Freudian forgetfulness is very pernicious on such themes. The shock of death makes it a matter of displaying the most formidable courage to go over in one's mind the incidents of previous deaths. Magic gives a very full and elaborate account, in the book, Magic and Theory and Practice, gives a very full and elaborate account of this memory, and Liber Fischarb a sound official instruction on the two main methods of acquiring this facility. One moment, though, about the fear of death. The radical cure is gaining the magical memory. The more previous incarnations one can remember, the less important appears the moment when the curve of life dips below the horizon. How to acquire that memory? The development of the magical record is by far the most important of one's weapons. How to use the record is not easy to explain, but there is a sort of knack which comes to one suddenly. And there are certain types of samadhi during the exercise of which these memories appear spontaneously, without warning of any kind. Particularly useful against the fear of death is the punctual and vigorous performance of Liber Resh. Meditate on the sun in each station, his continuous and even way, the endless circle. That formula in the Tarot book is most valuable. Let's see. Another one we've got is Liber HHH. It's a small print, so again, not necessarily intended for you to read, as I said at the beginning. But I'll just share with you just a couple of small extracts. Think of thy death. Imagine the various diseases that may attack thee. See, like medical students' disease. That may attack thee, or accidents overtake thee. Picture a process of death applying always to thyself. A useful preliminary practice is to read textbooks of pathology and to visit museums and dissecting rooms. So yeah, you can see like those plastic people were cut apart and look at their organs and stuff. Continue this practice until death is complete. The visualization, I mean, I'd not like do this continuously until you die, but imagine the death and the disease process until you imagine your own death. Follow the corpse through the stages of embalming, wrapping, and burial. And then jumping down to the end here. For this is a mighty meditation and holy, having power even upon death. Yea, having power even upon death. Then we get this note at the bottom by Frater O.M. warning us that there is also danger of acute delirious melancholia at this point. So if Liber HHH were a map, this would say, here there be Goths. Another thing that may or may not be applicable to you, but it turns up in Crowley's writing, so I want to say something very briefly about it, is this idea of the book Liber Cadaveris. Now, this is not an OTO ceremony, so I'm not going to go into detail here. Just suffice to say that this ceremony, also known as the ritual passing through the Tuat, is the Zelature AA initiation ritual, and it involves some stuff that's very similar to what's in HHH. So for those of you who are on that path, that would give you another opportunity to confront and deal with death stuff. So in addition to these exercises, there are also some magical formulae that you can look at, and these would include those of Iao and 93. How can I use these? Well, I'm glad you asked. But actually, before I get into quoting Crowley, again, I always hate to assume that people know things, even in a room of practiced magicians as we have here. So I'll just say very briefly, Iao is that classic Golden Dawn formula of Isis, Apophis, Osiris, representing like 3 stages that one goes through when one's working at various levels. Where the Isis phase is kind of like the honeymoon phase, where you're just beginning the great work or a project or whatever it is we're talking about, and you're really into it and you're really dedicated and intense. And as you persist with the work, there's a point where it gets hard. You enter the Apophis phase. You kind of hate it, and you just want it to go away and be over. And the idea here is that you push through and you persist through that dark night of the soul, as it were, until you break through to the Osiris phase. And that's where, your enthusiasm is renewed and reborn. And it's the whole idea of the Iao formula is to push through to that stage. So, in his comment on Liber 65, Crowley writes of this, the meaning is that the formula given by Aiwass destroys the idea of destruction as such. What was until now called death, the means of resurrection in the formula of Osiris, Iao, is to be understood henceforth as love under will. And in the vision and the voice, Crowley writes, in the new eon, death has become life triumphant, not through resurrection, but in its own essence. The Thelemite does not suffer death. He is eternal and perceives himself, the universe, by virtue of the categories of life and death, which are not real but subjective forms of his artistic presentation. It's life, it's performance art. I like that. Osiris, tricked into the belief in death, had to overcome it by magic, by the formula of Iao. As far as 93, Crowley tells us in Magic Theory and Practice that this is the number in the word of the law, thelema, will. And again, do thy will. We've realized that's one of the best ways of dealing with death and so on. And agape, of love. Love and death being flip sides of the same coin. Crowley goes on to write, it is furthermore the number of the word which overcomes death, as members of the degree of Master Magician of the OTO are well aware. Again, this is a general talk, so I won't say anything more there, but if you come to my 3rd degree talk on the flip side of lunch, We can say more about that. But needless to say, again, for initiates of third degree, you've got some tool for meditation and for magical work using that formula in addition. So, armed with these philosophical and practical tools, you can not only come to terms with death, but also do the work to make sure that when your number is up, that you too can be granted the accomplishment of your wills. Yea, the accomplishment of your wills. So mote it be.
This has been a production of Speech in the Silence. Thanks for listening. Visit us at speechinthesilence.com or write us an email at thelimapodcast@gmail.com. Love is the law. Love under will.